Hello, Oscar. Grandpa here, and guess who? Hey, Moosey! Moosey. So Moosey's been very good and has been looking forward to saying hello to you, haven't you, Moosey? Yeah, I have. Lots of love from me and from Granny and everybody else here. How about that? I hope you're well, and Mummy and Daddy and your lovely little sister. So we were reading, we're going to need to finish the story of Mr. Fussy, and Mr. Fussy was sitting at home and Mr. Clumsy came to stay. And Mr. Clumsy sat as he always did in a not so neat and tidy fashion. Oh dear. How long are you staying? Asked Mr. Fussy. I don't know, grinned Mr. Clumsy. A few days, a week, a year. I haven't decided. That was Mr. Clumsy. Wow, he is looking very dishevelled, isn't he? Very messy. When he awoke in the morning, Mr. Fussy jumped out of bed and went into the bathroom. Oh no, he gasped. Oh no. Oh yes, Mr. Clumsy had been there before him. The towels lay in a heap on the floor. The bath was full of water. There were pools of water all over the bathroom floor and half a tube of toothpaste. Look, there's all the toothpaste all over the floor. What a mess. Mr. Fussy made it all neat and tidy as quickly as he could. Then Mr. Fussy hurried downstairs. Morning, said his cousin cheerfully. I've cooked you breakfast. Sit down. There was an awful mess everywhere. There we are, said Mr. Clumsy, carrying a plate of fried eggs, broken fried eggs, towards the table. Breakfast. And then he tripped over those shoelaces of his, and then the eggs flew through the air, and then they landed all over Mr. Fussy. Look, he's got a sunny side egg up all over him. Oh dear. Sticky, greasy, yellow fried eggs. Whoops, said Mr. Clumsy. After a week, Mr. Fussy's house didn't look like Mr. Fussy's house any more at all. Look, it's got broken windows, the doors hanging off. Goodness knows what's going on. Look, the trees have snapped in two as well. But after 2 weeks, Mr. Clumsy decided to move on. Thank you for having me, he said to Mr. Fussy. It was very nice to see you, replied Mr. Fussy politely. But what he was thinking was, it's very nice to see you going. Cheerio, said Mr. Clumsy, and off he went with his battered old suitcase. Goodbye, called Mr. Fussy, really meaning good riddance. So that's Mr. Clumsy saying goodbye. And Mr. Fussy is really so pleased he's gone because it's been such a mess. Are you messy, Oscar? Or are you a good boy? Put all your things tidily away when you go to bed. Yep, of course you do. Really? Then Mr. Fussy fussed around his house as he'd never fussed before. Fussy old fusspot. Polishing and mending and repairing and straightening and sorting out and cleaning and putting everything back exactly as it had been before Mr. Clumsy had come to stay. He even dusted the flowers in the garden. That's silly, isn't it? Nobody dusts the flowers in the garden. Silly Mr. Fussy. That evening Mr. Fussy was in his kitchen, polishing an egg, when he heard a crash outside. Oh no, he groaned. Not Mr. Clumsy back again. It can't be, it mustn't be, it isn't. And it wasn't. It wasn't. It was somebody else. Ooh, who can that be, Oscar? Somebody who had just walked straight through Mr. Fussy's garden gate. Somebody who can't help having little accidents. Somebody you may have met before, Oscar. So who do you think that's going to be? Hello, smiled Mr. Bump. I've come to visit. Isn't that lovely? What a lovely story. Okay, Shall we try, how about a little bit of Mr. Greedy? Fancy a little bit of Mr. Greedy then, Oscar? I think we're going to have a great story here. Mr. Greedy liked to eat. In fact, Mr. Greedy loved to eat, and the more he ate, the fatter he became. And the trouble was, the fatter he became, the more hungry he became. And the more hungry he became, the more he ate. And the more he ate, the fatter he became. And so it went on. There he is, look, munching away on a great big cake. And the cookie on the side was that slice of the cake, I think. Mr. Greedy lived in a house that looked rather like himself. It was a roly-poly sort of house. One morning, Mr. Greedy awoke rather earlier than usual. He'd been dreaming about food, as usual, and that had made him wake up feeling hungry, as usual. There he is, look, in bed, dreaming about eating. I don't know. So Mr. Greedy got up, went downstairs, and ate the most enormous breakfast. This is what Mr. Greedy had for his breakfast. Mr. Greedy had 2 slices of toast, 1 packet of cornflakes, 1 bottle of milk, 1 bowlful of sugar, 3 slices of toast, 3 boiled eggs, 4 slices of toast, 1 butter dish, and a pot of marmalade. Granny makes great marmalade, doesn't she? I don't know if you've ever tasted it. Oh, Mr. Greedy, how can you eat all of that? When he had finished his enormous breakfast, Mr. Greedy sat back in his chair, smiled a very satisfied smile, and thought. That was a delicious breakfast, he thought to himself. Now I wonder what would be nice to have for lunch. He decided, in order to work up an appetite for lunch, he would go for a long walk. There he is, look, having just enjoyed his breakfast. He does look rather chubby, doesn't he? I think he's overeating. That morning Mr. Greedy walked and walked and walked. Then he discovered a cave. That's funny, he thought. I don't remember seeing that there before. And there's Mr. Greedy out on his walk, and he's discovered a cave. Mr. Greedy, being a curious sort of a fellow, decided to explore. He entered the dark cave. Inside he discovered some giant steps leading upwards. Mr. Greedy, being a curious sort of a fellow, decided to climb them. There are the steps, giant steps. They were very steep and very difficult to climb, but with much huffing and puffing, Mr. Greedy climbed up and up. At the top of the steps, Mr. Greedy came to a door. Oh, that's a big door, isn't it? You can just see Mr. Greedy at the bottom, peeking round it. It was without doubt, excuse me, the biggest door that Mr. Greedy had ever seen. And it wasn't quite shut. Mr. Greedy, being a curious sort of a fellow, decided to see what was on the other side of that door. So Mr. Greedy squeezed himself through the crack in the door, and there before him was an amazing sight. The biggest room in the world. Can you imagine that, Oscar? The floor was as big as a field. The table in the middle of the floor was as big as a house, and the chairs around it were as high as trees. Mr. Greedy felt very small. Then he sniffed. Coming from somewhere up on the top of that gigantic table was the most delicious foodie smell that Mr. Greedy had ever smelled. So there he is, right at the bottom of a very large table and a very large chair, and he can smell this foodie smell. So what's he going to do, Oscar? Mr. Greedy sniffed again, and then he decided that he must get up onto the table. So he began to climb up the leg of the enormous chair. It was very difficult and it took him a long time, but eventually Mr. Greedy stood on the table. Everything was larger than life. The salt and pepper pots were both as big as pillar boxes. Look at that, aren't they huge? Mr. Greedy does look very happy, doesn't he? There was a bowl of fruit on the table, and Mr. Greedy tried to lift up one of the oranges. There he is, look, right at the underneath the orange. He's so tiny. And Mr. Greedy, being Mr. Greedy, took a bite out of one of the apples there. Look at that, he's taken a little bite out of one of the very big apples. Then he looked round. Over on the other side of the table stood the source of that delicious smell. A huge, enormous, gigantic, colossal plate. And on the plate, huge, enormous, gigantic, colossal sausages, the size of pillows, and huge, enormous, gigantic, colossal potatoes, the size of beach balls, and huge, enormous, gigantic, colossal peas, the size of cabbages. Mr. Greedy hurried across the table towards the plate, and being Mr. Greedy, began to eat. There he is with all this huge amount of food, Oscar. What do you think happens next? I think something not very good is going to happen, don't you, to Mr. Greedy? Suddenly a shadow fell across the plate, and Mr. Greedy found himself being picked up by a giant hand and looking into the eyes of a real live giant. And who, thundered the giant, are you? Mr. Greedy was so frightened. Look, there he is, being held in this huge hand. Mr. Greedy was so frightened that he could only just manage to squeak his name. Mr. Greedy, he squeaked. The giant laughed aloud, a laugh as loud as thunder. Greedy by name and greedy by nature, he bellowed. Well, I think, Mr. Greedy, that you need to be taught a lesson. And what a lesson it was. The giant made Mr. Greedy eat up everything on that huge, enormous, gigantic, colossal plate. When he had finished, Mr. Greedy felt very ill indeed, as if he would burst any minute. Now, said the giant in a much quieter voice, do you promise never to be greedy again? Oh, yes, moaned Mr. Greedy. I promise. There he is, look, saying, I promise. So what's going to happen now, do you think, Oscar? Very well, said the giant, then I'll let you go. Mr. Greedy climbed down from the table and went out through the door, feeling very fat and extremely miserable. Oh dear, there he is. He's tiny compared with that boot, isn't he? And you know, from that day to this, Mr. Greedy has kept his promise. And you know something else as well, Oscar? Mr. Greedy doesn't look like he used to look anymore. He now looks like this. Look at that. That's like you, Oscar, isn't it? Nice and trim. So he now looks like this, which I think suits him a lot better, don't you? So if you know anybody who's as greedy as Mr. Greedy used to be, you know what to tell them, don't you? Eh? Beware of giants. Hey, that's another great book. So we've got a little bit of time just to start Mr. Forgetful. Just a little bit, not much. And start it at the beginning, as we always do. It was one of those beautiful summer mornings that everybody likes to see. In Forget-me-not Cottage, the owner was fast asleep. Mr. Forgetful. Oh, there's his cottage. Isn't that lovely? Ah, and Mr. Forgetful was having a dream. Then the sun streaming through the windows woke up Mr. Forgetful. Oh, he yawned and stretched his arms and tried to remember what he'd been dreaming about. But of course he couldn't, because Mr. Forgetful can't remember anything at all. Anything. Ever. There he is, lying in bed, and when he wakes up he can't remember anything. I think that's a bit like Grandpa sometimes. Yeah, no, you don't have to laugh quite as much as that, Oscar. Mr. Forgetful got out of bed and went to wash his face. So what happens next, do you think, Oscar? Well, we're going to have to read that next time. That sounds exciting, doesn't it? So, there we are. It's been lovely reading to you, and I hope you're having fun. Love seeing you doing some riding. I thought that was absolutely wonderful what you're doing, and you so like riding on ponies and horses, don't you? So fantastic, and lots of love from Grandpa and Granny and from Moosey, and we'll see you next time. Bye.